Hello, welcome to Chapter 8. We're going to talk about metabolism and energy in this first segment, and then the second segment will be more about enzymes and their function. Okay, so if you remember, a cell is the simplest form of life. Within a cell, there are hundreds of different chemical reactions happening. And it's using energy in order to do this, and creating energy. So cellular respiration is one process that occurs inside a cell, which extracts the energy from, let's say, food in order to be able to allow the organism to do work. Some organisms basically need food in order to obtain energy. Some of them actually form energy from chemical energy, like the process of bioluminescence. Bioluminescence is basically the conversion of chemical energy to light, and these are some organisms that can actually do that. Now, an organism's ability to transform this energy, these different types of energy sources, are subject to the laws of what's called thermodynamics. Now, it sounds like a very scary term, but it really isn't. Metabolism is all of the chemical reactions that occur in an organism. So all of them collected together. A metabolic pathway is a process that starts with a chemical and then ends with a different type of chemical where energy is either absorbed or released during that process. Okay, so a metabolic pathway. Metabolic pathways are a series of chemical reactions. So here, this is a simplistic metabolic pathway. So here we have A, which is the starting molecule of the pathway. And A is converted to B in reaction 1. B then is converted to C in reaction 2. And then C is converted to D, which happens to be the product of this chemical pathway, in reaction 3. As you can see, there is a different enzyme that is required for each step. Now, if we remember what an enzyme is, remember we talked about proteins before in former chapters. An enzyme it's a protein that actually helps catalyze a chemical reaction. And what I mean by catalyze, and we'll kind of define this later, is it helps speed up the chemical reaction, but it does other things too. So let's talk about the types of pathways that there are. There are catabolic pathways and anabolic pathways. Catabolic pathways actually release energy. Catabolic pathways break down complex molecules. They break down the complex molecules into simpler molecules. An example would be what we just talked about, cellular respiration. Anabolic pathways are pretty much the opposite. They consume energy to build complex molecules, using the simpler ones that were broken down during catabolic pathways. An example would be protein synthesis. So the simpler ones would be the amino acids. And when you connect the amino acids together, remember that dehydration synthesis reaction, or that dehydration reaction, you create a more complex molecule. That's an anabolic pathway. What happens inside the cell is a whole lot of things. So this image here represents probably not all of the chemical reactions that we know about. However, it does represent a huge portion of the chemical pathways that occur inside a cell. So you can see a bunch of arrows crossing between two or more major pathways. So a lot of these pathways overlap in some way. And it kind of makes sense, right? So let's say you take in a food molecule, you break it down to glucose and fatty acids or something. Well, the glucose and the fatty acids are going to be used to make other things like glycogen or phospholipids, right? The highlighted area right here is what we're going to be discussing in Chapter 9. That represents cellular respiration. Cellular respiration has many stages to it, and you can kind of see that with the highlight, how it's highlighted. We'll talk about those stages when we get to that point. Now we're going to kind of move into talking about energy more specifically and how it's obtained and the types of energy that exist. Okay, so there are different forms of energy, and really, what is energy? Energy is the capacity to cause change. Yeah, so energy, if you think about it, changes from one form to another, but it can actually cause change, right? So it can help things change, right? So we know that it exists in various forms, so let's talk about those various forms. Kinetic energy is a type of energy associated with motion or movement. Okay, so there's some examples of this: thermal energy and heat, or heat, pretty much the same thing. Thermal energy is actually kinetic energy, which is associated with the random movement of atoms and molecules. Heat energy transfers between organisms. So heat energy actually is not available to do work, but it is energy that is generated from kinetic energy. Potential energy is really where it's at. Potential energy is the energy in which molecules have, or organisms have. Okay, so it's there and it's available to do work, and it's usually in the form of some sort of chemical. Okay, so chemical energy is a potential energy, and it's available to do work. It's not actually doing work, as in kinetic energy, but it's available to do the work. Now, let's talk about like energy of movement and potential energy in relation to like more broad processes. So if we look at these people, right? We have a diver, and he's getting ready to dive. He is standing on the platform, getting ready to move, right? However, he's just standing there. That's potential energy. Now, when he starts to dive, okay, diving actually converts this potential energy to kinetic energy. So remember, kinetic energy is the energy of movement. Now, a diver has less potential energy in the water, okay, than on the platform. Okay, so basically energy was, so here we've got energy, high potential energy, and then we've got the energy of movement, it's moving, to low potential energy. Climbing back up converts the kinetic energy of muscle movement to potential energy. So we've got the muscle movement, right? And then it's going to be potential energy once this diver gets on the platform, is getting ready to dive. Looking at a bear, and the difference between kinetic energy and chemical potential energy and heat, right? So here we've got a bear. He's caught a fish, and that is his food, right? So this is chemical energy right here. This is potential energy. It hasn't been broken down yet. It hasn't been used, right? The energy in it hasn't been used at all. But now look what's happening. He's running. Right? So he ate the fish. The fish is being broken down, and he's using the energy from that fish, from the breakdown of that fish, to run. Okay, so he's running. This is kinetic energy. And while he's doing this work, some energy is being released as heat. Okay, so that's another form of kinetic energy. And of course, respiration, right? So this is the process of basically expelling the carbon dioxide from the breakdown of the chemical energy, and of course, water. Now let's talk about the laws of thermodynamics, or energy transformations. Thermodynamics is basically the area of science which studies the transformation of energy. Okay, so basically studying the conversion of one form of energy to another. Now there's isolated systems and open systems. We are open systems. An isolated system, there's no exchange with the environment. So there's no exchange of energy. So it has that energy and it just stays that way, right? It stays as one form. Open systems exchange energy with their environment. Okay, so basically energy and matter are transferred between open systems and their environment. Organisms are open systems. Like I said, we are an open system. If we were not an open system, we would be dead. Now, according to the first law of thermodynamics, energy of the entire universe is constant. So you can't just lose energy. The universe isn't just going to lose energy or gain energy. Okay? This is also called the principle of the conservation of energy. So conservation of energy. So energy is conserved. Okay? So it's not lost or gained. It's just transferred from one form to another. Okay? So when we look at the bear, we've got this chemical energy. This is potential energy. Well, once it's broken down and the bear uses it to do work, that's just, there's no gain or loss of energy. It's just converted to another form, which would be kinetic energy. Now, according to the second law of thermodynamics, all energy transformations, right, increase the entropy of the universe. So let's talk about this term entropy first. Entropy is a term that describes the disorder of a system. Okay, so basically when organisms use kinetic energy to do work, this creates disorder in the universe. Okay, so it increases the entropy of the universe. And it increases the entropy by the release of energy forms like heat. Okay, so heat cannot be used to do work. It's lost within the system or basically transferred to the universe without the ability to use it to do something, right? So it's not really a usable form of energy, heat. All right, so that's the second law of thermodynamics. So it has to do with entropy. The free energy, or what's called G, or Gibbs free energy, can be used to determine whether a reaction is spontaneous or non-spontaneous. And this is kind of important. So spontaneous processes typically increase the entropy of the universe. So they must increase the entropy of the universe. The non-spontaneous processes are going to decrease the entropy of the universe. So spontaneous processes readily happen. So they happen without really the need for energy. Generally, they release energy. And non-spontaneous processes generally absorb energy. So they must take in energy in some way. This can be done using now, looking at this, what we do is look at the change in free energy. So the presence of free energy is just the amount of energy that's there available to do work. Now the change is what's released during a chemical reaction, or not, depending on the type of reaction it is. So the change in free energy is represented by delta G. So delta is often used in science and chemistry as representing a change. So the change in free energy during a process is related to several other things that are happening, right? So enthalpy is actually a number, right, which represents the total energy or the change in total energy, which is delta H. So the total energy is H minus the change in entropy, right? So delta S. S represents entropy. Remember, we talked about entropy. It's the disorder of the universe, right? Which is going to be directly related to the temperature. And the temperature for this equation is used in kelvins, which is the absolute scale. So if we look at this equation, we have delta G is equal to delta H minus temperature times delta S. When you do this calculation, when you know these numbers and you do this calculation, when delta G is negative, that means it's spontaneous. So if you think about it, A spontaneous process increases the entropy of the universe. So basically, this change in S is going to be a high number. And when it's multiplied by the temperature, and under the current conditions, whatever they are, that's generally going to be a pretty high number, right? So when that number, that term is subtracted from delta H, it makes delta G more negative. Okay, so spontaneous processes, again, you can see this is represented by this equation that they generally increase, or they're associated with an increase in the change in an increase in entropy of the universe. All right, so spontaneous processes can be used to do work, and how this is done is that spontaneous processes can help drive non-spontaneous processes. All right, so let's look at this process. So here we have the energy of motion. So here we have potential energy here. Remember the diver? And then we have the kinetic energy. Okay, so this potential energy can be converted to kinetic energy in order to do work, the dive. Well, this can be applied to other things as well, things that you have learned up to this point about molecules. Right? So let's look at diffusion. The process of diffusion. So look, we've got this, let's say this is a solid, sodium chloride, and it's a solid right now, and it's diffusing into water, creating an aqueous solution of sodium chloride. So the solid is potential energy. Well, as it's moving and dispersing through the process of diffusion, this is kinetic energy. Now, larger molecules, the same thing, right? So let's say we have a molecule which is going to be broken down by a chemical reaction. Okay, so let's say we have this molecule, it's going to be converted to all of these products. So it's going to be broken apart. Again, this is potential energy. And then the chemical reaction converts it to other forms, but that process is kinetic energy. So when you move from higher energy, which is the potential energy, so remember those are higher energy, to lower energy, which is kinetic energy, the energy of movement or random movement, you go from higher to lower, the change is negative. Those are spontaneous processes. All right. So looking at this, just, explaining what I just described, but in text form, we have more free energy, which is in the potential energy, right? So we have the diver standing there, we have the solid of sodium chloride, and we have that molecule, which is going to be broken apart. Those are less stable, but they have greater capacity to do work because they're potential energy. They're storing energy. Once this energy is released, it can be used to do work. So during the process, right? So let's say during the diving process and or the diffusion process and or the chemical reaction, spontaneous change, okay, what happens during this process? Free energy of the system decreases. So you go from a more positive free energy to a more negative free energy. So the change is going to be negative. Okay, it's going to be less than zero. The system starts to become more stable. This released free energy can be used to do work. Okay, and then you end with basically a lower free energy. So remember, we're talking about the change, it's lower, which is more stable, and then of course less capacity to do work. Now, let's talk about free energy and metabolism. The concept of free energy can be applied to the chemistry of life processes, like we kind of showed with diffusion and the diver. Now, when you look at that overall chemical reaction, it really represents exergonic versus endergonic reactions in terms of chemical reactions, right? So we have exergonic reactions. Those release free energy. Those are spontaneous processes. Okay, so an exergonic reaction is going to start out, right? So we have the reactants. They're going to start out at a higher energy, and the products are going to be lower energy. That's exergonic. It released energy, and that energy can be used to do work. So just the opposite of that, we have endergonic reactions. Those take in energy, so they absorb energy. Endergonic reactions need energy in order to proceed to completion. These are non-spontaneous. Okay, so endergonic reactions are going to have a delta G that is positive. Exergonic reactions are going to have a delta G that is negative. Now let's look at this graph right here. This is a graph that's shown in your textbook. So we have, this is the progress of a reaction across the bottom, and then this is the amount of free energy that's present. So we're looking at an exergonic reaction here. So during exergonic reactions, energy is released. Exergonic reactions are spontaneous. So let's look at the process, right? So remember, we have the reactants on the left and the products on the right of a chemical reaction. The reactants have this much free energy. Okay, so you could actually put a number there. Let's say it's like 75 kilocalories per mole or something. So then after the chemical reaction, the products, okay, so the reactants are converted to products. The products have a lower free energy. So the free energy went from high to low. So the change in free energy is less than zero. It's negative. When that happens, energy is released. So if we look at just, okay, so let's say the reactant started out at 25 kilocalories per mole. But then after the chemical reaction happened, the products have a greater amount of energy. Okay, so this makes the delta G positive. So here the delta G is greater than zero. So here, this is the baseline right here. Reactants started here. When the reactants were converted to products, the products turned out to be higher energy. So energy was absorbed during this process. Now, in terms of equilibrium, so remember equilibrium. So closed systems will eventually reach equilibrium and then can't do any work. So they might start out doing work, right? So here we have the delta G is less than zero. It's doing a little bit of work. It's releasing energy, and they're in this process. This energy is used to light this light bulb. Since it's a closed process, it's going to reach equilibrium. So here we see that equilibrium has been reached. Now we have no change in free energy, right? So the free energy of the reactants is the same as the products. Okay, so here delta G is zero. If we compare that to an open system, just like a cell, right, or an organism, they're not in equilibrium. They generally will not reach equilibrium until they have died. Right? So here we have a constant flow of potential energy, right? This could be food entering the organism. And then this could be food being broken down by the cells. And then the light could represent the work that the organism is doing. Let's say you want to go for a jog, or even just sitting here, you're burning some energy, maybe not that much. And then look, we have a continuous flow out of this part of the system. Okay, so this will never reach equilibrium until the input of, let's say, food has halted. So this is part of why you need to keep eating. Now, if we continue this, right, we can represent a pathway, right, a metabolic pathway. Specifically, this would be a catabolic pathway, because remember, catabolic pathways represent pathways that break down things and release energy. You can see that the energy is being released at every stage of this pathway because the light is illuminating. Okay, this is an open system, and it's done in a stepwise fashion. You can see with a metabolic pathway. Now, a cell can do three main types of work. And it's the hydrolysis of ATP, remember ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which powers this work. Okay, so there's chemical work, there's transport work, and there's mechanical work. So some examples. Chemical work would be driving endergonic reactions. Remember, endergonic reactions need energy. Transport work, Remember, transport against the concentration gradient, active transport. And mechanical work. The contraction of muscles would be an example of a mechanical process that requires energy. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the structure of ATP again. Remember, ATP is called as adenosine triphosphate. And this represents here the adenosine, so that's adenine, which is a nitrogenous base, attached to a pentose sugar. And then attached to that sugar are 3 phosphates, the triphosphate part. These phosphates have anhydride bonds is what they're called. And you can see there's a lot of oxygens in between the phosphates. Remember, oxygens are negatively charged, so they're going to repel each other. So there's a lot of repulsion going on in these bonds or between these functional groups. However, they're still connected by covalent bonds. So there's a lot of energy being stored in those bonds right there. When you break them, that energy is released. Now, when ATP is hydrolyzed, it releases energy. And where does this energy go? Right? So think about it. We've been talking about this all along. The energy is actually used to drive endergonic reactions. Remember, exergonic versus endergonic. Exergonic reactions release energy. Okay, they have a delta G of 0. Hydrolysis of ATP is an exergonic reaction. Well, when it's broken, that energy is released, and that energy is actually used to drive endergonic reactions. Okay, so basically, endergonic reactions are connected to exergonic reactions via that energy. This is called energy coupling. Energy coupling is when, for example, the hydrolysis of ATP is used to drive an endergonic reaction. Because the hydrolysis of ATP is an exergonic reaction, releases energy to actually drive that endergonic reaction. Now let's look at this process. So look, we've got adenosine triphosphate. This is just a simplistic view of it, not really accurate. Adding water, this is hydrolysis, you're breaking this bond. So here you've broke one phosphate off of it, now it's released as inorganic phosphate and energy is released. So whatever energy was stored in connecting this second phosphate with the third phosphate is released upon hydrolysis. This energy can be used to drive an endergonic process. Exergonic reaction releases energy. That energy is used to drive an endergonic reaction. This is energy coupling. This is often done through creating a phosphorylated intermediate. A phosphorylated intermediate is basically a molecule in which a phosphate has been attached to it. And when the phosphate is attached to it, it makes it more high energy, makes it more reactive. So it increases the chances of driving that endergonic reaction. Let's look at an example. So here we have glutamic acid. Glutamic acid is one amino acid, okay? And if you add ammonia to it, it creates another amino acid, glutamine. Okay, so this has to happen inside the cell. The delta G for this reaction is positive 3.4 kilocalories per mole. So that's the amount of energy that must at least be put into that system for it to create the glutamine. Okay, this is endergonic. This is an endergonic process. Now, how are we going to get that done? We want to get that done by hydrolyzing ATP and creating a phosphorylated intermediate. Let's look at that process. Now, when we combine glutamic acid with ATP and then hydrolyze that ATP while we are trying to create glutamine, when we hydrolyze that ATP, the phosphate that is released during that hydrolysis is attached to glutamic acid, creating a phosphorylated intermediate. This phosphorylated intermediate is more reactive. It's got that phosphate on it. So now when ammonia comes in, it'll readily basically attack that phosphate, right? So it'll attach to where that phosphate is attached to. So now we have ammonia attached to glutamic acid, creating glutamine. And we have ADP, and then that phosphate will be released as inorganic phosphate, which will then, basically these two will recombine in the ATP cycle. So it gets recycled. Okay, so that's the process of energy coupling. So let's look at what to the delta G when that happens. So remember, the delta G for the conversion of glutamates to glutamine without the use of ATP is positive 3.4 kilocalories per mole. But the hydrolysis of ATP is negative 7.3 kilocalories per mole. When you combine them together, you have an overall net delta G of negative 3.9 kilocalories per mole. That makes it spontaneous, and it makes the overall process exergonic. Okay, so we combine an endergonic reaction with an exergonic reaction to create a net exergonic reaction. Okay, so for the reaction or the coupled reactions to remain exergonic, the net delta G must still be below 0. Now remember, transport. We have transport work. Remember the transport proteins. So the sodium-potassium pump, if you remember that, it involved the creation of a phosphorylated intermediate. Remember that process? Right? So this is actually what's happening. So it makes it more susceptible to change. And this allows that transport protein to change shape and open and close on either side of the membrane, allowing solutes to pass through against their concentration gradient. Vesicles, the movement of vesicles inside the cell. What happens is we have a vesicle, right? So remember, vesicles are spherical molecules that are made up of membrane. Well, they have proteins on the surface of them. And then motor proteins, look at motor proteins. Remember, motor proteins allow things to move, and they require the hydrolysis of ATP for that energy from that so that they can do their work. They basically walk along the microtubules. So this yellow bar is like a roadway, right? So it walks along the microtubule in the cell and moves from one location to another. Okay, so look, you can see it's walking with its little legs. Right, so this requires energy. And then look, we have the ATP cycle, and like I said, ATP isn't really used up. The energy is used from the hydrolysis of ATP. However, ADP, the product of that, plus the inorganic phosphate get recombined as long as energy from catabolism is still continually being put into this open system. So this would be like food, right? So as long as you're still eating food, you're still able to extract the energy from that food and then use that energy to do cellular work. So in summary, I kind of talked about in general what metabolism is, what the difference is between catabolic and anabolic chemical reactions, energy transformations. There's 2 laws of thermodynamics. Remember the first law, the energy of conservation, or the conservation of energy, and the second law has to do with entropy and the release of heat into the system, increasing the entropy or disorder of the universe. And then we talked about just ATP and transformations, energy coupling. Right, so all of this has to do with metabolism and the extraction of energy in order to do work for cells to be able to stay alive. All right, so the next part of this particular chapter is going to have to do with enzymes. So we're going to dig deeper into enzyme function and how they work.